Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story that was not so long ago. Actually, I didn't even know about the terrible experiences some people had on Craigslist until after this incident. As long as you were careful, I always believed it to be reasonably safe. However, it seems that I broke my own rules. I had only moved into my new house for a month when this occurred. It was I made a lengthy move across the nation to a new area. Prior to the move, I sold nearly everything. In order to find anything I might need, mostly furniture or simply items to make the place feel less empty, I would first idly browse Craigslist whenever I was bored. Actually, I'd already located a couple items on Craigslist, picked them up, and had no problems at all before this. Everything. So, I really didn't have much reason to be afraid. I happened to scroll past a post of a rather attractive couch one evening after work, at a reasonable price of $200. It was nearly exactly what I was looking for, a grey sectional sofa that seemed to be in excellent shape. The man answered really rapidly. According to the book, his name was Brian, and he appeared to be a laid-back guy. After settling on a price, we began organizing our meeting. The fact that I just owned an SUV was the main problem. He lived in the next town over, so I would have to make several trips there and back to bring the entire thing to my house. It might be able to accommodate one piece of the sofa at a time. When I explained that I was unable to move the entire couch, he graciously volunteered to deliver it off at my house once using his pickup truck. It was far more practical and logical to do it this way, even though I obviously wanted to see it in person before purchasing it and didn't feel comfortable giving my address to a stranger. Furthermore, he wasn't at all pushy or strange about it. He actually gave the impression that he had a solution. Thus, following a little, I agreed after giving it some thought. We agreed that he would stop by my house at 5:30 the next day. After sending him my address in the morning, I had to go into bed early. I spent the remainder of the day cleaning the other rooms in the house. When 5:30 drew nearer, I remained in the living room with the blinds half open, watching TV. I noticed headlights coming down the road almost at precisely 5:30. A couple of seconds, a black pickup truck came along slowly after that. When they came, I saw that the truck's bed was empty of a couch, so I assumed it was just a neighbor or something, and I kept waiting. But a few minutes later, the same truck drove past once more. The way they slowed down, as if they were passing by my house, or perhaps even gazing through the windows, was incredibly odd. In a way, just made me feel nervous, but I decided it was nothing. After texting Brian to confirm that he was still on his way, I resumed watching TV. There were no more trucks going by outside after I sent that text. The fact that Brian never texted me back, however, was even stranger. He never came or even gave me any updates. He should have arrived at 6:30, but an hour went by. He blocked my number when I tried to text him again, and it didn't go through. Overall, I was more annoyed that he wasted my time than I was worried about what went wrong. He might have found someone else who was willing to pay more. He either ghosted me because he didn't want to deal with breaking the terrible news to me, or something else came up. I suppose it occurs. I was largely over it by the time it got late in the evening. I ate dinner, organized my workspace at home, and spent the remainder of the evening lounging in bed and watching YouTube. I can't even recall going to sleep. I believe I fainted during a video, but I'm very certain I was unconscious for a few hours at the very least. In the middle of the night, I awoke to an incredibly eerie sound. I was positive it was the front door creaking open, and it was a long wooden creak. Being the only squeaky door in the home, it always irritated me, so I knew. However, who in hell opened it? I listened while sitting up and looking toward my bedroom door. I could hear subtle footsteps moving into the house below me. If it weren't for the echo of the empty house, I doubt I could have heard them. I could feel myself beginning to panic, but I stayed motionless, nearly motionless. As they came to the bottom of the stairs, the footsteps appeared to cease. A man's voice called out after a long pause of several seconds, but not just anything. He called, "Call out my name." I didn't recognize the deep, older-sounding voice as that of someone I knew. Once more, he called my name. The disturbing thing was that it was emotionless. He spoke in a monotone, repeatedly calling my name from the foot of the stairs as if he was aware that I was upstairs. I silently grabbed my phone and dialed 911. To be honest, I felt like I had no choice, but I was really afraid he would overhear me speaking to the operator. I muttered as softly as possible. The man continued to call my name from the stairs. I got out of bed and went to my closet as soon as the police arrived. I was uncertain whether the man would truly approach to search for me. I wasn't taking any chances because it was obvious that something was wrong with them. However, the man's voice ceased calling out just 30 seconds after I entered the closet. I was unable to hear any other sounds, such as doors or footsteps, from the closet. I became quite worried because I didn't know where he was or whether he could be outside my bedroom at this very moment. Thankfully, within a few minutes, officers showed up. The house was deserted. That guy who entered was gone, whomever he was. I was certain it had to be Brian, so I told the officers about the Craigslist incident right away. I mean, earlier that day I'd seen that truck suspiciously driving by, and I'd just given him my address. I was sure they could find him because I still had his phone number. However, there were some issues. It came out that he wasn't blocking me when my messages weren't getting through. It was because there was no longer that number. There was a due date. It was impossible to link it to him. Furthermore, even if we were to identify him, there would be no means to peg him for being the one who entered. I'm nearly certain, though, that it was the Craigslist guy. Perhaps he intended for me, whoever answered his ad, to visit his home, where he would be more equipped to carry out his intended task. However, he believed he could still carry it out by breaking into my house for some reason. Perhaps he thought too highly of himself. Really, I have no idea. The fact that he remained downstairs and simply called my name is also quite odd. In any case, I changed the lock on my front door and installed a camera after the police stated that it appeared he had picked it. I'm attempting to take all the required safeguards because I truly didn't have the option of moving. Since Story 2 by KCC, nothing has happened. Occasionally, I find myself searching for random items I might need or want on websites like Craigslist, eBay, and others of a similar nature. Similar to internet thrifting, it was enjoyable and occasionally even helped me find amazing discounts on items I otherwise wouldn't have purchased. This occurred in 2018, which is quite some time ago. Craigslist had a few items that caught my attention. A bin full of house decor was displayed in the listing, such as picture frames, candles, and other adorable home accents. Since my apartment was somewhat empty, I reasoned that adding a few haphazard decorations would make it more lively. The woman, April, was really nice when I messaged her. She essentially stated that she wanted to sell everything she didn't want or that she believed might break during the move because she was moving. She didn't mind selling them for extremely low prices because she just wanted to get rid of everything. She offered to let me choose anything I wanted for $20, or even everything if I wanted it all. On a Thursday night, after she left work at 6 o'clock, we decided to meet at a nearby parking lot. That day, I left the office at 5 o'clock, so I headed right there. We decided to meet at a grocery store parking lot, which was somewhat crowded at the time. Many people were arriving and departing. I just waited after texting April the location of my automobile and its appearance. Since it was midwinter, I had the car running hot and hoped she would arrive as soon as possible. However, a few minutes after I arrived, I received a text message informing me that she was leaving late and that she hoped we could meet up nearby. This was obviously a little annoying, but she seemed really sorry, and if it saved us both time, I suppose it wasn't too much to ask that I drive a little bit more. I simply entered the address into my GPS and began driving to the other parking lot that April had sent me, which was closer to her. I wasn't sure exactly where it was bringing me because I hadn't spent much time on that side of town. It took roughly 15 minutes to drive. Since it was winter, the sun had already set and it was fairly dark outside. Even though I arrived at around 6:30, the fact that the lights were off in every building in the parking lot, however, added to the darkness. It was basically a small lot for an outdoor strip mall, but it was deserted and there was just one car parked close to the far end of the parking spaces. As I pulled in, I had a strange feeling. The only vehicle parked there, according to April, was a red Toyota SUV that she owned. I parked a few spots away after driving over. It was quite odd to see this abandoned, empty lot in contrast to the crowded public parking lot she had previously selected. Since I was already here, I told myself I would just observe how things unfolded, and I would dip out if something made me feel too strange. I exited my vehicle and waited for April to follow suit. As I stood there, I became aware that I was unable to look through her windows. Perhaps they were tinted, but it was also hard to see through them because of the illumination. However, as I stood there in the cold, I began to feel less at ease. I was only out there for a mere 15 seconds when I made the decision to return, enter and depart as soon as their door opened. However, a man left, wearing a bulky tan winter jacket and with dark hair. He appeared to be in his 30s. He hurriedly stated that he was come to deliver the items from Craigslist because April was unable to make it and was still stuck at work. I felt this was really strange because if that were the case, I would have received a text. I had the impression that I was not aware of that knowledge until I had already arrived. He also said that he would let me take everything for free if I wanted to, which made me hesitant to reply. He gestured for me to approach and take a look while grinning and opening the trunk. I was certain that I would not go over there, but I wasn't exactly sure how to get out. Perhaps I wouldn't be so doubtful if this were all happening in a more public setting. However, I felt somewhat uneasy out there where no one else was present. I hastily began getting back into my vehicle. As I mentioned, I was just going to give April a brief call to double check. As I walked back and picked up my car, his smile dimmed. After checking my messages, I dialed April's number. The faint ringing of a telephone came from outside a few seconds later. I examined. He put his hand in his pocket gently and hung up. I felt sick to my stomach. As soon as I turned on my car and drove away, he began rushing up to my door. There was never a person named April, and I was fairly certain that this was all a setup. Most likely, that man was responsible the entire time, posing as a gullible woman selling decor in the hopes of entice more girls like myself. If I had approached his car's open trunk, I can only speculate what could have happened. When I called my sister after that night to discuss what had happened, she advised me to call the police, so I did. They were unable to take any action, though, because nothing actually occurred, and it is technically illegal to pose as April, even though it is suspicious. I think it's obvious that this was a setup with probably terrible motives. All I can hope for is that no one else was duped. Story 3. By anonymous music. I've been living a typical city life for a few years. I spent almost every day of my life there. I had a condo a few miles away from everything, was quite convenient where I worked, so there was no reason to go elsewhere. However, I had a few problems with my condo this week that were becoming incredibly bothersome, and it would have been extremely expensive to hire someone to fix them. However, I didn't have any tools. I just checked Craigslist to see if anyone was selling any used tool kits in order to save as much money as possible. It was time for me to get one. In any case, there were surprisingly many. I only needed a few necessities, but some of the deals were worse than others. I therefore continued searching until I came across what appeared to be a good deal, a gently used tool kit that had everything I needed. We were scheduled to meet within 15 minutes after I sent an email. The man invited me to come by his house and pick it up whenever I had time tomorrow. I was okay with working till 7 because I generally prefer to stay up late. But, at least to me, his address was rather remote. It was in a tiny town that I somehow had never heard of, 45 minutes outside the city. It appeared as though there were just about 100 dwellings clustered together in one location on the satellite view of the maps. I took the drive out of the city the next day after work. After I got away from all the buildings, the roads were genuinely quite pleasant and rather deserted. When I began to get close, it was well after sunset. It looked like mostly wooded areas with just a few gas stations and shops around. To put it mildly, the area I pulled into was dubious. Every one of the buildings, which were obviously quite old, were strewn across the woodland. They appeared to have had no renovations and to have been there for more than a century. Some certainly appeared deserted. As I proceeded down the forested road and eventually arrived at the address the man had provided, I was a little put off by this. It had the same appearance as every other house, old, little, and hardly able to stand. Although I felt a little uneasy about this neighborhood, it was in the back of my mind that I was very much from the city and wasn't used to places like this. I therefore reasoned that it might not have been as horrible as I was portraying it. After parking at the end of the driveway, I got out. I was immediately struck by how silent it was. It was so silent that it was strange. No people outside, or sounds emanating from any of the houses, or even cars driving by. Just utter silence. I approached the residence and rapped on the door. I was waiting on the porch when I got this weird feeling that had me looking over my shoulder. However, the door opened a minute later. The respondent was of ordinary height, with a messy beard and longish brown hair. He certainly didn't have the best appearance. He led me into the living room, where a heavy tool bag containing all the tools he was selling was seated on the couch. The fact that there were essentially no lights on in the house added to the spooky atmosphere. In the living room, there was just one bulb that hardly made anything beyond shadows. Additionally, I saw that the back door by the hallway was hanging on its hinges as we entered the living room, seemingly broken in the doorway leading outside. To be honest, I just wanted to pay for the kit and get out of there, but I wasn't precisely sure what to look for. When I realized he wasn't there, I just took out my cash and turned around to give it to him while pretending to browse through it. There was nobody in the room. What the devil happened to this guy? The home was rather silent when I called for him. All throughout the house, there were faint creaks coming from the walls and floors, but I was unable to determine whether or not this was due to the old house settling. My adrenaline started to spike. I believe I had a gut feeling this was terrible. I yelled one out, more time with him. I left the tools behind and walked carefully back to the front entrance. However, there was a person standing there as soon as I entered the hallway. The guy was different. He was standing in the shadow, so I couldn't see him well, but I could tell he was taller and wider than the other guy. If it's okay with you, I was just going to get some cash in my car. Carelessly, wishing that he would simply step aside and release me, he didn't respond. He appeared to be purposefully obstructing the hallway with his posture. A little later, I heard a creak to my right while I stood there trying to figure out what to do. I looked around. It was completely dark in the room next to me. It was the kitchen, if I had to guess, but to be honest, I couldn't tell because it was so dark inside. My instincts for survival suddenly took over, and I ran to the damaged rear door. I remembered seeing a number of loud creaks that sounded like footsteps sprinting behind me could be heard as I hurried out of the home. Fortunately, there was no fence around the house, so I could just run around it and back to the front. Someone leapt out from behind my car and fled as I was sprinting back up to it. I simply unlocked it, climbed in, and then flirted out of there because I knew I had to leave even though I had no idea what they were doing. For some time after that, I was still experiencing an adrenaline rush. There were probably several people in that house, and I am fairly certain that one of them was attempting to either break into my car or stop it from starting, so I couldn't escape. I am unable to pinpoint exactly what they wanted to do, but if I didn't leave at that moment, I doubt that I ever would have. When I was 16, I searched Craigslist for a new gaming PC to purchase. After receiving my first paycheck, I wanted to indulge myself, so I spent almost every day after work browsing through any new advertisements until one caught their eye. It was a 3-year-old Alienware with respectable specs that was posted for just $200. The description stated that they had recently switched to a newer computer and had no use for this one, but it still functions just fine. All right, I emailed him, and he responded promptly. After exchanging a few messages back and forth, we decided to meet the following day, and he instructed me to meet him at a particular grocery store parking lot at 8 p.m. He gave a number of excuses for why he couldn't, saying that he would be busy all week and wouldn't be able to drive too far, so if I wanted it, I would have to pick it up nearby. It was a little far, so I proposed another place where we could meet halfway. I thought the deal was worth it and agreed to pick it up in the morning, even though I found it a little annoying. I gave it some more thought and nearly decided to cancel, but he sent me a few videos to demonstrate that the PC was operational and also stated that he would reimburse me if there were any problems, which helped me feel better about it. I drove the 35 minutes to the grocery store, where he instructed me to meet as soon as I parked into the parking lot. Lots of the only vehicle in the entire parking lot was a truck at the far back, and the grocery store's lights were off, as if it had already closed. I had assumed that the whole purpose of gathering at a grocery store was to ensure public safety. So this was despite the fact that I had already driven for over 40 minutes. I hoped everything would go easily, so I parked alongside his truck and got out. The man inside leaned over and peered down from his window. Didn't greet me, smile, or do anything else. Instead, he just looked down as if examining me, which made me feel very uneasy. Then he left. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s, with brown hair that was thinning in the front, and based on a glance at him, you could tell that something wasn't right. As he moved around and unlocked the back door, I tried to stay a few feet away. Inside, I could see the computer on the seat, but it wasn't the one nearest to us. It was on the seat farther away. I stood there awkwardly for a moment as my gaze shifted between him and the truck. He then gestured inside the truck and said I could take it out and look at it. His hand was still on the door, and he simply watched me, waiting for me to climb in and grab it. I began to move away from him and quickly got into my car when I noticed a little detail. The handle on the inside of the door that he was holding open was gone. It wouldn't take a genius to figure out what this was. He yelled at me to come back, but I immediately pulled out, and the man hurried into his truck, driving away instead of following me. There's little question that he would have closed the door behind me if I had crammed myself into his rear seat. It was clear that it was a trap because there was no handle inside. Regretfully, I just had his email to provide to the authorities, but there was no way to track it down. I only hope no one else. I've searched Craigslist a few times since falling for his unsettling trick to see whether his advertisement was back up for the PC in the hopes of setting him up with the cops or anything. I haven't seen anything yet, but he might be attempting to scam with a different item under a different alias, so I advised staying away from the second story. Written by anonymous Craigslist. Craigslist was crowded with private owners renting out their homes, so I used it to find a condo or room in a house to live in for a few months. Most apartments only have 1-year leases. All rooms were typically less expensive, and the proprietors were more amenable to extending the lease. With roughly a month to search, I discovered and visited a few locations, but they all abruptly withdrew, so I looked at another one. Roughly the same as everyone else, this 22-year-old young man who was listing a room for rent in a house 20 minutes from me texted me back and forth for a few days before scheduling a time for me to see. I felt a little less excited when I drove out there and reached the street with his address on it. The houses appeared to be in poor condition or hardly standing at all, and many of the yards were overgrown and even had trash in the front. Lawns, I suppose this is what happens when you can't afford anything better. But I'd hoped the house I was looking at would be a little better maintained. However, when I pulled into the driveway, it appeared that all the rest, but I thought I'd give it a try while I was here, so I stepped out and hit the doorbell. When it didn't work, I knocked right away, and there was a very awkward sound of heavy footfall approaching the other side of the door. Pause for perhaps a full 15 seconds, after which he opened it just a crack, revealing only half of his face as he asked me my name. I smiled nervously and replied, and he opened it completely, letting me in. He was tall and somewhat thin. He was clearly not in his 20s, but rather in his mid-30s, if not older, with shoulder-length hair and some tattoos visible on his neck. I was already inside the house at this point, though, and he was guiding me around. The man was talking constantly and moving quickly in the hallway, as if he was trying to show me everything quickly. This made it difficult for me to think about anything for very long or to recognize how strange the situation was. The kitchen was very old and dilapidated. He barely stayed in the room for a few seconds before heading into the next hallway, which had 2 doors. He approached the first one and turned to face me, saying, "This will be your room." Some of the cupboards were partially open and loosely hanging on their hinges. I finally had a chance to catch my breath and consider this after they opened the door and motioned for me to take a look. Since I was already in the house, I decided it would probably be best to just carry on with the tour. Evidently, he would never return, but as I stood there, he abruptly became irate, as if his face and entire manner had transformed in a matter of 3 or 4 seconds. He didn't say anything more, but began to approach me. I immediately retreated, at which point he began to move more quickly in my direction, matching my pace. I heard him halt at the front door and slam it behind me as I turned and ran down the hallway to leave the house. After I saw that nothing was adding up, I felt so foolish for ever going inside the house. Technically, nothing happened, but everything was pointing to a terrible conclusion, and I was too scared to attempt. Craigslist Story 3, once more by Richie. There are many homesteads on the East Coast where I reside, as well as ordinary off-grid cottages and homes. Some of these aren't completely off-grid, but they are located far out on sizable lots with more than 40 acres. Of purchasing used tools and equipment from neighbors or other locals is common here. At the time, I was building on my property and needed a flatbed trailer for my truck, so I could transport additional supplies from the hardware shops. Craigslist was the first and only website I looked at, and there were really a lot of used ones for sale because practically everyone in the area has one, despite the fact that they are ridiculously costly. I emailed several people, but only one of them responded. We then arranged a convenient time for me to visit, and all I knew going in was that his name was Devon, and that he had what I required. Once again, had no concerns going into it, because I had done this countless times before, and it was a very typical occurrence here. I travelled an hour from my house, largely on national forest roads, until I arrived at his driveway. The first thing I saw, though, was that his house was a tiny, very old-looking wooden cabin with a clearing in the trees leading up to it. It was like most places around here. simply a thin gravel road into the woods, was that there wasn't a flatbed trailer on the property. It's a big thing, so I thought I would see it as soon as I pulled in. The only explanation I could think of was that he must have kept it in a garage or shed in the back. I parked in the grass and got out, and after waiting for a few seconds for him to come out and greet me, I went up to the porch and knocked on the door. While I waited, I couldn't tell if any of the lights were on inside. It was difficult to tell because the windows were covered with curtains and the sun was still sinking. However, after waiting for a full minute, no one answered the door, and I began to suspect that no one was there at all. But suddenly I thought something was strange, but I also thought that I might be kept in the backyard. So I went around to at least take a look. The text was from Devon, telling me to come around to the back of the cabin where he had the trailer. I proceeded a little farther and stopped on the side of the cabin. Just before I reached the back, there wasn't even a clearing behind the cabin. There was just woods. When I turned the corner, all I saw were trees. I started to walk back to my truck since I'd had enough, but I heard something behind me. I turned to look at the trees once more, but I couldn't see anything. The sound I heard seemed like someone coming from just around the corner before I booked it for my truck. I only got a fleeting glimpse of the man charging at me. I'm not sure if he gave up right away or had another plan, but I kept walking faster and faster until I heard loud footsteps pushing through the grass behind me. However, the man was gone when I got in and turned to face the cabin. I left and drove to the closest town, where I spoke with the police. To put it briefly, the state was unaware that any cabins had been constructed. When they looked into that land, which was supposed to be an empty parcel, they found it to be abandoned. The man was obviously not trying to sell me anything, and he was undoubtedly setting me up for something of malicious intent. I assume he was concealing waiting along the cabin's rear wall to leap on me as soon as I turned. Fortunately, I was aware of a problem and didn't go back there on foot. Who knows where I might be at this moment. When I need to buy something, Craigslist is rarely my first choice, but occasionally you can find good deals on items that would otherwise be very expensive. At the time I was looking for new exercise equipment, and since weights and machines are very expensive to buy new, Craigslist was the ideal place to find used ones for a low price. Nevertheless, I browsed the site for several days past before I finally came across a posting that looked really nice. It was a set of weights for a pretty good price, and it had only been up for a few hours. The poster's name was Mary, so I emailed her to express my interest in her weight set and my desire to pick him up as soon as possible. Mary responded a short while later. She replied with her address, so of course I looked it up to see where it was and what the house looked like. She said she was available tonight when she got home from work at 7, which was a little late, but it wasn't a huge deal for me because I wanted them as soon as possible. The house was 20 minutes away, and it was in a small neighborhood that I was actually in, familiar because one of my old friends used to live close by. The house was normal in size and had no distinguishing characteristics other than that it was quite old. However, nothing about it seemed odd or unsettling, so that evening I drove down there. The house was in a cul-de-sac at the end of the road, so I parked on the side of the house by their mailbox. I went up to the front door, which was already open, and knocked a few times to get someone's attention because I didn't want to just walk into the house. A moment later, a man who was supposed to meet with Mary to look at some exercise equipment she had put up on Craigslist came down the hall. His face brightened, and he said, "Come on in." He informed me that Mary would be downstairs in a few minutes while she was changing out of her work clothes, which undoubtedly made me wary, but he sounded sincere and credible, so I followed him into his living room, where there were some weights on the floor, but no other furnishings or decorations at all. I believe the man noticed me glancing around, and he quickly explained that they were trying to sell the weights because they were moving out. I was still dubious, but after a moment I noticed that some plates were missing. I asked him if this was all there was to it, because I thought I saw more in the photos. I asked him if he could go check on Mary to let her know I was here, or he smiled again and said that Mary might know where the others are. He waited for a moment before agreeing and going up the stairs. I was clearly starting to worry that Mary might not even be a real person at this point, so I listened. After a few seconds of silence, I moved to the bottom of the stairs and looked up towards the top. The man was standing there, staring at the wall, likely waiting to make it appear, as though he had actually gone to ask someone. I became terrified, realizing that I started to hurry to the front door, hoping not to wake the man. But as soon as I turned around, I heard heavy footsteps rushing down the stairs. He called out for me to wait, and I ran straight out the front door and into my car. Oddly, as I drove away, the man ran out the front door, and around I didn't really know what the man's plan was, but I was certain that he was up to something. So after leaving the neighborhood, I pulled over on the side of the house and called the police to tell them what had happened, so they could figure it out. The officers later stopped by my house, and I gave them more details, and they informed me that the house where I had met him had been empty for more than a year, which naturally made me shiver. However, I was only able to describe the man's appearance, and other than that, all they could rely on were the weights he had placed in the vacant house, which may have fingerprints on them, which makes me concerned that he might still be out there luring people into deserted houses. But I'm also relieved that I managed to leave before he did whatever it was he intended to do. Story 2. I had recently graduated from college and needed a modest place to stay while I worked part-time at a small grocery store while I was looking for a new job. But now that I had graduated, it was time to start looking for a better job anyhow. Apartments were too expensive for me to rent alone, so I was primarily looking for places with extra rooms for rent. I knew it would be awkward, but I didn't have many options, to be honest. My former college roommates advised me to check Craigslist, because, at the time, most other websites didn't allow you to post single rooms in a house, or perhaps it was just difficult to find them. Craigslist seemed to have a ton of options, so after a few days, I stuck with it. Began to become irritated because no one would respond to my requests, and those who did would simply say they were already taken. However, on Saturday morning, a new room appeared. It was reasonably priced and appeared to be quite nice. Tom, the advertiser, was marketing the property as a big house with a spare bedroom for rent that also had, I thought that having a separate bathroom and closet would be ideal. So I sent him an email to express my interest before heading to work. Since I knew the listing had only been posted that morning, I was sure that I was the first to get in touch with him during my lunch break. I checked my emails, and Thomas responded, inviting me to come look at it that afternoon. We agreed on a time after work, and even though I knew I would be exhausted, I really wanted this place, so I drove there right away. It was only 10 minutes from the outside, and the house looked really nice. It honestly just looked like a typical medium-sized neighborhood house. I parked on the side of the road, approached the door, and then gently knocked after 30 seconds. Then again with a little more force this time. A minute later, I took out my phone to text Tom, but before I could send the message, he opened the door and invited me in. I noticed right away that he was sweating profusely, as if he had just finished a long workout, and that he smelled terrible. To avoid being impolite or anything, I chose to ignore it. He started showing me the kitchen and living room on the ground floor, saying that he didn't use them frequently, so I wouldn't have to worry about getting in his way. However, it appeared that he used them frequently because the couch was stained and the sink was full of old dishes. I didn't like how filthy the entire place was, and it was odd that the photos made the house appear to be very clean. One thing I remembered in particular was that the living room had a brown leather couch, the photo, but the real couch was black. I assumed Tom would use the old photos of the house. I was a little irritated by the dishonesty of it before it sold, but the only thing that mattered was that my room was upstairs. Tom led the way to the stairs, but he stopped when he got to the bottom of them and held out his hand, as though he wanted me to go upstairs first. I felt strange and uneasy as I started up the stairs because Tom didn't. He stayed at the bottom and grinned, saying that my room would be the first one on the left. I followed him to the top and went a few steps into the hallway before hearing a soft thud behind the door to what was supposed to be my room. I turned to face Tom again, who had lost all of his smile. In an irritated tone, he responded that it was just one of his friends spending the night, and that I shouldn't worry about it. He then encouraged me to see the room for myself because he was certain that I would like it. I was definitely quite anxious at this point, afraid even, and I wondered why he hadn't informed me that there was another person present. I tried to appear confident and started to descend the stairs as I explained that the place wasn't going to work out for me. He didn't seem to like that response, and he shifted his body to block most of the view, something that I should know. Everything started to add up, and all I wanted was to leave right away. I firmly told him that I had to leave from the bottom of the stairs. He asked me to check out the bedroom again to see if I liked it, but I told him again that I wasn't interested. He looked at me for a moment, and then, to my surprise, he smiled and said, "Okay." Stepping aside, I hurried past him and straight out the front door. I don't know what was going on in that house, but something didn't feel right about any of it. I even felt lucky to have been able to leave so easily in the moment. I thought I was going to have to force my way out. I checked Craigslist a couple hours later, and the posting had been removed. I still wonder who and what was in that for all I know. The room upstairs might have been empty, but I have a feeling it was something much worse. Story 3. I spent a few years in a small house with a friend of mine, Nick, during my time in college. He was my roommate during my first year there, and after that, we decided to leave the dorms, and since we both had respectable jobs, we decided to split the rent on a house. Since this was our first time renting a place, we weren't sure how to properly budget, but after a few months, everything was fine. However, it wasn't until nearly a year later that we realized this place was draining both of our bank accounts, so the obvious solutions were to either move out or find another roommate, because neither of us wanted to move out. So we began looking for a roommate. We first asked all of our other friends, but none of them were interested, so the only thing left to do was post online. Nick and I have never done this before. Nick posted on Craigslist and I posted on Facebook Marketplace, and it felt a little strange, but we knew we had little choice. A few weeks passed with only a few responses, none of whom were serious about moving in, until Nick showed me an email he received from a man named Sam in response to his Craigslist ad. The man appeared genuine, and the next day he came over to look at the house. I should note he was a couple years older than us and had just graduated, but he seemed pretty nice and looked clean and everything, so we were glad to have him. He agreed to the split of rent and moved in the next week. The few months following, Sam would hang out with us a lot, and we actually got to know him pretty well. But then all of a sudden, he became very closed off for some reason. Nick and I hardly ever saw the guy, and when we did, he would hardly speak. He would spend most of his time in his room with his door closed, only coming out to go to work or get food. I didn't mind, I just thought it was a little odd. In any case, it wasn't until about month 4 of his presence that things began to. Things took a turn for the worse. I had just arrived home from work when Nick called my name softly from the living room. He explained that Sam was home, so I didn't want to talk too loudly. And then he told me about a strong odor he had noticed today while passing his room. I told him I hadn't noticed it. I got up and walked quietly down the hall towards Sam's door after he pointed to his room and told me to pass by quietly to see if I noticed. I didn't even need to get very close to smell what he was talking about. It was terrible and extremely disgusting, and I had no idea what it was and had never smelled it in the house before. I accepted Nick's suggestion that we ask him what it was, so we both went to his door, while trying not to breathe in too deeply and knocked repeatedly while calling out to him. When he didn't answer, Nick claimed to be certain that Sam was inside. But after a few more minutes we gave up and decided to ask him tomorrow. We both made a quick dinner because it was getting late, watched TV in the living room while we ate, and then went to bed. The following day, I saw Sam leaving the house and asked him what the smell was. He replied that I had just taken out the trash, so he hurried off. That response didn't really make sense to me, but I didn't want to put too much pressure on him. I told Nick later that day, and he acknowledged that it was strange, but he was at a loss for what to do. So we decided to leave it at that. A few weeks passed, and Sam hardly spoke to us at all, but by this time, the smell had disappeared. I arrived home from work late one evening, and both Nick and Sam were likely already asleep in their rooms, so I went straight up to my room and dozed off as well. However, sometime during the night, I woke up and heard movement downstairs, which was Sam's room. I listened for a few minutes to try to understand what he was doing, but Sam left the house to go to work as usual the following morning, but he didn't come home that night. A few more days passed, and he still hadn't returned when I called him several times, but his phone immediately went to voicemail. We were beginning to worry, so we decided to check his room to see if there were hints about what was happening, because his room was quite disorganized, and it appeared that many of his belongings had been packed up and removed. I also discovered a pair of glasses in his drawer along with some other odd items, which was strange because Sam didn't wear glasses. He left some clothes and all of his items left, which led us to assume that he hadn't just moved out. Nick then called the police to report that Sam might have gone missing, and an officer showed up that evening to look into it and question us. We told him everything we knew and allowed him to view his room. Additionally, Nick gave him a photo of the two of us taken when Sam first moved in. We didn't hear back from another detective until a week later, when they told us that the man in the picture wasn't Sam, but rather a family member who recognized them as their missing son. After a year or so, the case became much more complicated, and we had little useful information because the man lied about everything he told us. As a result, we lost contact and stopped receiving updates, and we were told that the man was just a normal guy living with his parents when he abruptly disappeared, although he never returned to our home for an unknown reason, and I'm not sure if he was ever apprehended. It's undoubtedly the most fascinating and unsettling experience I've ever had, simply knowing that I shared a home with someone who created a totally false identity and was legitimately. I get chills whenever I think about missing. When you think about it, it's difficult to believe that this individual was attempting to conceal from the authorities due to something he had completed or was completing. This occurred last summer. I'm a 32-year-old man living alone in an apartment outside of the city. I had recently moved here and had thrown away a lot of my old belongings from my previous residence, so I was occasionally browsing Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. I was shopping for some furniture, and the two items I most wanted were a coffee table and a TV stand. Since I wasn't in a rush, I didn't mind looking for a few weeks if necessary. I recall that it was a Monday night, and I had just arrived home from work when I was reading through some posters I came across a coffee table on Craigslist at the dinner table that I loved. It was inexpensive, not too old, and in decent shape. I sent an email and kept scrolling, but I didn't receive a response for more than 20 seconds. Cole, the man, said he could sell it to me, but only tonight because he emailed me an address. So I quickly Googled it and saw that the house was 25 minutes away. I replied, "Sure, just let me know where to pick it up from." He was moving out and intended to throw it away in the morning because I had nothing else to do that evening. Even though I was exhausted and it was becoming late, I didn't mind making a short pickup because I had never been to the neighborhood before. I told him to give me an hour and I will be there. Additionally, I was delighted to have a coffee table in my living room at last, and I finished my dinner at the table, then got into my car and drove there. Since it was a little raining outside, I was hoping the table wouldn't be too heavy and that we could get it in my car fast without it getting wet. The journey there felt drawn out, with winding roads leading to a small neighborhood with inadequate lighting by, even though it was late and I didn't expect everyone to be awake at this time. It was still a little eerie when I found the house, because there weren't many street lights and most of the houses had their lights off. One story: when I parked my car in the driveway of one of the few houses with lights on, I noticed a man standing in the garage's corner, as if looking for something. He gave me a quick glance before rushing inside. I waited for a minute, expecting him to return, but he didn't. I got out of my car and went into the garage, banging on the door. When no one answered, I knocked again, unsure if I should go to the front door or something, but it was causing me. I had a strange feeling and was about to leave when the door unexpectedly opened. It was a different man from the one I had seen in the garage, but he introduced himself as Cole and asked me to come look at the coffee table. I followed him into the living room, where the table was exactly as it appeared in the photos and was in perfect condition, so I was ready to purchase it. Cole was engaging me in small talk about his recently purchased new home, but each time I tried to interrupt him to say I'd like to buy, he would continue talking at the table, and after 5 minutes of standing there listening to him talk over me, it became awkward. It felt more like he was keeping me there than anything else, so I finally interrupted him and said I had to go home quickly. He abruptly stopped talking and offered to give it to me for free. I dubious thought, okay, and then asked if he could help me carry it into my car. We both took it and began to walk it through the house. It wasn't particularly heavy, but it was definitely a 2-person lift, and after we got it into the garage and put it down to rest, I heard someone running up behind me. They were wearing a mask and a hoodie, and I froze, feeling both scared and perplexed. Cole simply stood there looking blank, and the man, who was not particularly hostile, demanded my phone and wallet while brandishing a knife at me. He asked again, louder this time, but I didn't feel threatened enough to comply, so I put my hands up and ran for my car. The man lunged at me, but I rushed inside, locked the door, and backed out before they could do anything. I then saw a cut on my arm that went through my shirt. The man must have slashed me, but I was too busy to notice it at the time. I stopped a few miles down the road and contacted the police, giving them the address and the description of the 2 men. With the end, the officers asked Cole, who was actually his name, and after a short interrogation, he acknowledged that the man with the mask was his friend, and that they were merely attempting to rob me, as they had no plans to sell anything. And since it was their first time trying something like this, and they were both young, I assumed they were anxious, which is why it seemed so weird to me. Fortunately, the cut on my arm wasn't very deep and didn't even require stitches when it came time for them to finish it. A few accusations, but nothing major. I'm glad I chose to run though, because I worrying that if I had let them take advantage and rob me, then they would have had the confidence to continue doing it after this, though I don't think they'll be trying. That again the second story, written by PL. Thank you. I understand that I may receive criticism for this, but I used to use Craigslist a lot to defend myself. I always met people in public and made sure to speak on the phone before leaving. And getting to know them for me was the simplest way to acquire stuff that would otherwise put my account in the red for years or sell random objects around the house. Nothing happened to me. I met a lot of strangers and sold or bought more things than I can remember. However, everything changed after this. I was looking for a bike and found a nice one for a low price. It might not be very nice, but it just looked like a regular bike and was supposed to still work, so that was okay with me. I emailed the person about my interest, and they responded within an hour saying it was still available for the indicated price, and after a brief phone conversation, we decided on a petrol station that was halfway between us, and that the agreed upon time was 6:30. On the day of the meeting, I drove out and arrived at the Station for gas. He said he would be driving a blue Chevy truck 15 minutes early. So I remained on the lookout. 30 minutes later, the man was still not there, and since I didn't want to do the deal in the dark, I texted him to ask if he was close. I received a call a minute later saying, "Sorry, I'm on my way right now, be there in a few minutes," but he hurriedly hung up before I could say anything. His hurried speech made it difficult to determine whether I should be concerned about the odd manner of the call, or if he knew he was going to be late, so he was just trying to get here as soon as possible. I waited in my car for him for another 15 minutes, and the truck he drove was really old and worn out, so I wasn't too happy about buying anything from him. I exited and said hello to him. He was a man of average height, dressed loosely, and appeared to be in his 20s or 30s. He had unclean hair and clothes that didn't look like they had been washed. He went to his truck bed and opened it, taking out the bike. Contrary to everything else with this man, it was shockingly in perfect condition and didn't look particularly fancy, but it was clearly well cared for. After a little walkabout and a minute of writing, everything seemed okay, but as soon as I put everything together in my mind, my enthusiasm vanished. After seeing the man in his truck, I realized that this bike was most likely stolen because it was at least 5 or 6 years old and had no scratches or particles of dirt on it. I also knew that I wouldn't feel comfortable purchasing it unless I was certain it wasn't stolen. I attempted to be unobtrusive and asked, "How long have you had it?" He gave me no answer, so I asked, "Why do you want to sell it?" I assume this is a very normal question, but his response confused me. What does it matter? It functions properly. Ironically, he was the one who was anxious after making me wait for him to arrive. I told him that I no longer wanted it and wished him a good evening before opening the door of my car. Before I could fully open my door, the man quickly slammed it shut. "No, you're not buying it. I didn't come out here for nothing." I knew this was a bad situation, but I wasn't too concerned because I saw some cars and people nearby at the gas station. I did, however, voice my concerns about where he paused, then pushed me against my car and yelled at me to give money. He attacked me again, forcing me to take out my wallet and give him all of my money. He then got back in his truck and sped off, nearly causing an accident on the way. I told him I wasn't going to buy what wasn't his. As I was leaving the gas station, I glanced around at the 3 or 4 individuals who were just observing. None of them offered assistance or even stayed to serve as witnesses, and the police never located him, so I lost $100. Although I don't want to be that person, I also kind of lost faith in others, because they didn't care to aid me, but did want to see me beaten and robbed in public. Story 3. Written by No Name. A few months ago, I put an old laptop up for sale on Craigslist. One think I listed it for $80, which was a great deal, but after a few days went by with no replies, I largely forgot about it until I had to buy a better one for work, and I really had no reason to have to. A week later, when I checked my emails again, I noticed that I had received a message asking if it was still available. They simply replied that they wanted to look at it and that they could stop by tomorrow, and we decided on 5 o'clock. Later that evening, I discovered that I had never received his name. The email address he was using was a personal one that resembled a gamer tag, so it wasn't really helpful. I assumed he simply didn't know what address he was using. The next day, I contacted him and gave him my address a few hours before 5 o'clock. Since it was my day off, I would be at home all day, till about 4:30. I looked over my emails once more, but the man had not replied to my final message. Perhaps he didn't think it needed a response, so I went over and pulled up the blinds on the window to see him. Then I sat on my couch and turned on the television. I sat there for nearly an hour, watching TV and glancing out the window every few minutes. But they never showed. Considering our last contact was from yesterday, I figured he had second thoughts and was standing me up. In all honesty, I didn't think that much about it. I just continued watching TV and tried to enjoy the rest of my night. I was sleeping on the couch as usual by 8 o'clock when I heard a knock at my back door. After I regained consciousness, I got up and checked outside. But there was nothing there, so I turned on the porch light just to be sure. Yes, but the sound I heard in the empty backyard was difficult to trace because I wasn't even awake. I assumed it was someone attempting to open a door, so I went around making sure all the doors were locked, and then looked out the windows to see what I could see, until a knock on the front door prompted me to approach quietly and check the peephole. I noticed a man in his late 30s, possibly on my porch, pacing back and forth and muttering something under his breath before he stopped and returned to the door and knocked once again. I asked, keeping the door closed and still seeing through the peephole. He gazed at the door before stating that he was attempting to speak with the homeowner, but it was clear from his slurred speech and stutter that he was on something or wasn't right in my head, so I didn't answer. When the guy realized this, he called out to me again, saying he really needed to talk to me. He was pacing and acting really eerie as I watched him. I took my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911, and he knocked again while I was on the phone. But then he dashed into the garage from the porch. I quickly grabbed my more recent laptop and opened the live feed from my security camera, which was located directly above the garage. His car was seen parked all the way up my driveway. Most likely just as the man was trying to push the garage open with a crowbar, just inches from touching my garage door. He looked crazy, but it worried me. After a few unsuccessful efforts, he got into his car and started moving around in an attempt to find something in his glove box before exiting and using his crowbar to strike my garage before leaving, even though he had given the police the video footage of the individual and his vehicle. The man is still anonymous, and it's not obvious whether the Craigslist had had anything to do with it, but I'm certain I have no idea what that man wanted or what he would have done if he had gained entry. I moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment when I was 18 and lived there until I was 20. I made the decision to leave the apartment and rent a modest home since I had a better job and more money. It wasn't extravagant, but it was a good improvement from where I was living. When I set it up coming from the apartment, my furniture was much too small and didn't match the interior of the house. It just looked like I had moved into a house. That was the only thing I didn't account for when I used to live there, larger than I could afford. So over the course of the following few months, I saved more money and set it aside to purchase new furniture. In addition, I listed a ton of items on Craigslist to begin selling, aside from the couch and a few other items as long as they could help me get anything out of my house. I didn't care about getting compensated. I posted the majority of the dressers, storage shelves, and other large furnishings for free. I sold and donated most of the items until there were just 2 things left. A month later, someone finally got in touch with me regarding a bedroom dresser and knit stand that no one appeared to desire. They inquired if they were still available and if they were indeed free. I responded yes to both, and we decided on a time for pickup. I didn't get home from work that day until an hour before they were scheduled to arrive, but when I arrived at my house, a truck was in the driveway. I pulled up next to it and peered in the window, but no one was there, so I opened the garage, parked, and left. I went back outside to examine the weird vehicle in my driveway some more, but this time I noticed someone inside. They waved and came out, identifying themselves as the Craigslist employee who was there to pick up the furniture. I waited a moment to react because I said to meet at 7:30, but you're an hour early. I was attempting to find out where they were when I got in. He apologized, but he had to arrive early due to an unforeseen circumstance. I'm still baffled as to why he didn't text me before his surprise visit, but since he was here, I let him inside. He took a moment to look at the things and said he would take them. I helped him move the big dresser into his truck bed, and we returned for the knit stand, but as he did, there was a shuffle coming from downstairs. followed by a quiet thump after glancing down the stairs. I turned to face the man who was now staring at me uncomfortably. "Everything okay?" he muttered in a monotone, and I reluctantly nodded before continuing on. The entire encounter was quite strange from start to finish, but what I discovered later that night was horrifying. I observed a tiny smear on the wall just outside one of the windows, so I shut the door behind him and peeked out the window to make sure he departed. Downstairs closets, as if someone had brushed against them. I searched further and discovered very faint shoe prints inside the closet, indicating that someone had been hiding there. After putting the two pieces together, I was fairly certain that there was another person in my home in addition to the man. When they heard me come into the driveway after breaking in before I got home from work, one of them hid in the closet, while the other went back to the car. The shuffling sound I heard near the end was probably the other person getting out of the closet. I gave the police descriptions of the one man I saw and the truck he was driving, but the two men appeared to hide their tracks. As a result, it was a horrible experience, and I only utilized Craigslist when I could. Avoid having meetings in my place. If we do, I'll just donate items or purchase items on eBay. It seems like anyone can do anything these days, as long as they prepare ahead of time. Story 2 was written by Anonymous approximately 8 years ago. Craigslist was just another ordinary service. I used to hunt for a treadmill or an elliptical if I had something to sell or wanted something to buy on a budget. I lived in a nice community and was generally comfortable meeting new people and having a short exchange. Both of these were very costly to purchase new, but Craigslist frequently had used ones in decent shape for only a few $100s. I looked through a few listings and found something I liked, so I messaged the seller and they responded the next day. The vendor, when I arrived at the address Mike gave me, which was about 20 minutes from town, I was shocked to see that it was a farmhouse with a large amount of land surrounding it, but no crops or anything. He assured me the treadmill was in like new condition, and we made plans to meet later that day. Anything I parked in the front yard with a number of other automobiles and trucks after driving down the lengthy driveway. When I arrived, Mike was smoking outside on the porch. He shook my hand and showed me around. He reclined against the far wall and invited me to test the treadmill, which was set up in the middle of the home in his garage. I stepped on it and set it at walking speed, and it seemed to be functioning perfectly. However, when I turned it up a bit, it just turned off. I glanced at it bewilderedly, and before I could even make sense of it, the garage door slammed down behind me. It was so loud that I felt my heart race from the jump shock it gave me. I turned to face Mike, who shrugged. He expressed regret, stating that it was an old garage and that it occasionally happened. As I glanced back, I felt a chill go through me and realized the position I was in. "Did you want it?" "No, I don't think it works." I was anxious to respond. He looked at me and said nothing, but after a moment I broke eye contact because I felt a strange tension. He said, "No problem, I'll show you out," and waved me to follow him through the house since there was nowhere else to go. He led me down to the front door and stopped directly in front of it. There was a lengthy silence as he faced the house, which had the appearance of an old farmhouse from the 1900s on the inside, but was incredibly dirty with items piled up all over the walls, and even obstructing sections of the passageways. He turned to face me after failing to open the door. "I apologize," he muttered like a heartless psychopath. Knowing something was going to happen, my body turned rigid at that very instant. The man rushed toward me, grabbed my arm, and pushed me back farther inside the house. He pushed me along the hallway, nearly back to the garage door, as I began to scream and struggle to break free. Suddenly, I stumbled over one of the miscellaneous items that were stacked up, and as I fell, he also lost his footing. Slipping by me, I got up fast, sprinted to the front door, unlocked it, and fled to my truck. As I backed out, a man rushed from the door and ran toward my truck. I managed to escape, but my hands were when the police arrived. Nobody answered the door at the farmhouse, and the man never turned up the cars parked on the lot, but I did report the shaking on the steering wheel all the way home. Were discovered to be unregistered and lacking license plates, but one of them was discovered to be a recently stolen vehicle. The man I met didn't own the farmhouse. Instead, the owner lived in a nearby city after inheriting the land from their parents. They just used it as temporary storage or something because they hadn't had time to sell it. This occurred many years ago, and the man never showed up, so I know it's a lost cause, but it's still unsettling to think that he's out there. I'm not sure what he was trying to do, me in the past, or what he might be attempting to do to others today. Lion J's story no. 3. I had heard horror stories about Craigslist users being robbed, conned, or worse, but I was frantic to find a new apartment as soon as possible, and due to a limited budget, I decided to take a chance and began looking through Craigslist's housing section. I saw an ad for a small apartment in a historic building downtown. The rent was reasonable, and the location was ideal for my profession. I emailed the owner, and he replied. After a brief conversation about the best time to meet, I drove over there a few days later, but when I got to the apartment building, I couldn't help but feel a little disappointed because the ancient brick front was crumbling and the windows were filthy and old. One of them was even boarded up. When I knocked on the door of apartment to be after climbing the stairs to the second floor, I was pleasantly surprised by how amiable the man was. He gave me a tour of the apartment, which was modest but pleasant and in good shape, informed me that he worked hard on it, and that the noise from the construction would only be temporary. We continued our conversation and went over the pricing, and I ultimately accepted the offer. Later that week, I moved in and got everything set up. 3 weeks passed with no issues or worries about the building until I began to realize something. Every time I saw the building's exterior, I couldn't believe I was living in a place like that, but I had to tell myself that it was the inside that counted. No one else appeared to reside in the building. I never heard anyone passing through the thin walls, saw anyone parking outside, or heard any construction going on, as the owner had stated. I kept these ideas in the back of my mind until one morning, as I was leaving for work, I saw that one of the doors to the other room was partially open. I ignored it and continued with my day, but when I returned later that evening, it was still open. After giving it some thought, I concluded that it must be unoccupied. I pushed it farther open. Inside the room was dusty and smelt bad. There were webs and stains all over the walls, and it looked like it had been abandoned for years. I stepped out and closed the door, annoyed that there was a room in the. I went up to my room in the building where I lived because it looked like that. But before I entered, I started to wonder about the other rooms. When I knocked on door to A of my neighbor and no one answered, I turned the doorknob and found it unlocked. Pushed open the door and saw that the room was identical to the other one, which appeared to have been abandoned for years. Feeling very uneasy, I returned to my room and texted the owner to ask if any of the other rooms were available for rental. I waited for the man to answer, but 10 minutes later, I heard the building's front door open, and they approached my door and knocked. Although my room was nice, it felt like I was living alone in an abandoned building, which was really unsettling and eerie. "Hi, who is it?" I asked them before I opened the door, and I could identify the owner's voice. "I opened the door and saw your text and thought I'd just come in person," he added, grinning. I smiled back uncomfortably, stating that I was merely interested in the other rooms and didn't want to admit that I had entered them because I probably shouldn't have. He kept smiling, so I thought I'd show you one of the rooms I'm finishing up. I followed him grudgingly across the corridor, but he then made his way to apartment 2A, the place I had just been in. He pushed open the door and entered, telling me to come in and take a look. I continued to think of an excuse, but he kept saying it until he insisted that I come in. I heard him hurrying down the stairs and out of the building, so I backed off and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. After I was certain he was gone, I started packing up everything, and the following day I left without turning around. I never saw that man again, and I never returned to Craigslist for anything, and I'm still curious about the building's true nature, and the owners were scheming. If I had entered that room alongside him, would I have been able to depart? At all. When I was 22 years old in 2013, I wanted to sell an old computer I had because it wasn't suitable to carry into a store or anything. It was just a piece of garbage that I believed someone else would find use for. I was only aware of Craigslist as a place where you could post and sell items on, and to be honest, I'd never heard anything negative about it. It seemed like a simple website where locals could get deals, and I trusted the neighborhood where I lived, so I didn't really have any second thoughts when I listed the PC on the website. It took me just one day before I received an email from someone prepared to pay me the indicated price providing it functioned as I said it would. I told him he could try it out when he picked it up, and we planned to complete the exchange. The following morning he said his name was Cameron, and that he'd send me an email when he was on his way the following day. I rose early and waited until 11 a.m. when he was supposed to arrive. I was expecting his email to confirm his arrival, but at 11:15 he had not sent anything, and I still had no email or indications that he will arrive. I made the decision to simply raise the blinds and watch TV while keeping a watch on the outside. Casey did arrive, but nothing happened until approximately 11:45 when I caught a glimpse of a car approaching slowly down the street and stopping in front of my house. I thought it was them, so I paused the TV and waited right on the curb while the car was running. However, after a few minutes, the car didn't move or turn off, so they abruptly pulled back onto the road and drove off. I got up and walked to the window to look at the road, but I wasn't really sure. Knowing what that was, I wasn't sure if it was Cameron or just a stranger who happened to stop by. For some reason, I closed the blinds and emailed Cameron to ask if he would be coming, but I never heard back, so after an hour, I was finished waiting and simply continued living my life without thinking about it. I ate lunch and dinner, then went to bed early at around 9 p.m. because I had to work the following day. I fell asleep fast, but I woke up after checking the time. It was just 11 o'clock. After just 2 hours, I closed my eyes once more and attempted to fall back asleep, but a very slight thump jolted me awake. In order to determine what it was, I laid there silently expecting to hear another. A moment later, it arrived once more. It came from somewhere downstairs, but I had never heard it before, so I was unsure of what it might be. I was concerned that there might be a problem with the house, so I got up and went into the hallway before heading to the stairs, where I heard it multiple times more. As I descended the stairs, the volume also increased, being much more than just a quiet thump. I slowed down, walked stealthily into the kitchen, and turned the corner into the back hall. As I gazed down the dark hallway, I heard another thump coming from right at the end of the house, and when my eyes adjusted, I could see outside the window. The dim form of a figure was moving. I jumped and stepped back from the figure as my heart briefly froze, and then the window shook with another loud bang. They remained motionless and turned to face the window, pushing their face against it as the shadow gradually grew clearer against the glass as their gazes met mine. Although I know it was only a second or two before they swiftly retreated and fled, that terrifying moment seemed to continue 4 minutes. I rushed and contacted the police, but they had clearly escaped by then, even though it appeared to be a straightforward case of it being the Craigslist Cameron man. It wasn't. Aside from the fact that it happened on the day I was meant to meet him, there wasn't any proof that it was him. I'm not sure what they wanted, but the bolt that held the window down had external divots that appeared to be an attempt to pry it from the window seal. Not only did I never learn anything else, but I also never used Craigslist Story to buy anima again. I moved out of my dorm room a few years ago and into an apartment with very little furniture. I was in need of everything because none of the things we had in the dorm belonged to me. I had more money than I had previously and intended to save for a few more months before buying a lot of items for the apartment. But there were still a few things I needed immediately, one of which was a bed frame. But they were all rather pricey, and I wasn't really looking to spend a lot of money on a frame after purchasing a new mattress. After looking through a few used furniture websites, I decided to use Craigslist because it had the most listings, many of which were really affordable, or even free, but they all looked awful. Then I found one that wasn't too bad. It was just an old wooden bed frame that wasn't too worn out. I quickly emailed to see if it was still available, and a minute later I received a response. I swiftly accepted the man's offer when he said it was still available for $35, which I thought was a great deal, and we scheduled a meeting for later that day at 6. In the meantime, I unpacked some items and rearranged a lot of things in the bedroom to create room for the frame, and at 5:30, the man sent me an email with the address was 20 minutes away, in a place I hadn't been to yet, although I wasn't quite familiar with because I had recently relocated. I got some money and left, looking about a lot to attempt to familiarize myself with the surroundings, but halfway through the town was abruptly ended, and the area became much less populated with buildings and houses. This was not what I had anticipated, but when I arrived at the neighborhood where his house was, I felt a little better because the houses weren't too far apart, and it did appear predominantly typical, but they were unquestionably not nice-looking homes. The front door was left open and the lights were on when I pulled up to the address and parked in the driveway. I got out and walked up, ringing the doorbell, and a moment later, a tall, heavy man wearing out arrived. I followed him upstairs and down the hallway that led to a small spare bedroom. He didn't look particularly odd when he invited me inside, but there was something about him that made me feel weird, like we'd been friends for years. We entered the room and I was instantly perplexed, with a dresser, knit stands, and clothing scattered about. The room appeared to be occupied. The bed frame even had a mattress with blankets and sheets on it. I made it clear to him that I was only interested in purchasing the bed frame, not the mattress or anything else, and he said, "Of course." I glanced back at the bed frame and saw that it appeared to be in good enough condition, so I decided to buy it. He grinned and offered to help me move it to my truck, but he said he would need a drink first. The man then returned to the hallway. Surprisingly quickly, he offered me one of the 2 glasses of beer he must have been holding in the next room. I respectfully declined, and he appeared perplexed, saying that since we were here, it would be fun to act as though we might as well hang around. I explained that I was quite busy. His smile became noticeably less genuine as he pushed me to have a drink with him tonight, even though all he really wanted to do was buy the bed frame and go out. In order to avoid being cornered in the tiny space, I hurried by him and into the corridor, telling him I was about to go, when he abruptly changed his demeanor to one of extreme niceness, apologizing and asking if I wanted to take the bed frame for free. I ignored him and continued down the stairs more quickly as I heard the man following me. Corridor, the bed and room were a little too weird, but I managed to get out before he caught up, and as I pulled away, I only saw him standing at the front door. Perhaps he was just a lonely guy living there that I wanted a friend to hang out with. Obviously being used by someone. I looked at the ad again when I got home that evening, but I couldn't remember it. I knew the frame was shown alone, without a mattress or anything, and now that I think about it, it's even odd that it wasn't that way when I arrived. His intention was to sell it, but whatever the man was doing, I didn't like. Story 3 by Aurora. I'm a female, aged 20 to 29, and this happened to me only 3 years ago. At the time, I didn't live close to my family, but one of them was dealing with a serious situation, so I had to remain there for a few months at the very least, and my alternatives for lodging were to rent a home from a private owner or stay in a hotel, both of which would be extremely costly. It's not simple to locate someone who will rent out for just a few months. The absolute minimum for most people is 6 months. I searched online for several full days with little to no success until I arrived at Craigslist. I knew the site had a section for renting, but I was attempting to stay away from it unless absolutely required. Nevertheless, I noticed I contacted the phone number shown on the page, and an older-sounding woman answered. She spoke slowly, but we chatted about the property. The house was small, which should have made it less expensive, and they didn't mention a minimum lease time and pricing, and she graciously allowed me to sign a 4-month lease. Fast forward to a few weeks later, when I returned to the property. It was somewhat near my destination, but it was also quite remote from the main city and somewhat tucked away. As was previously mentioned, the woman didn't meet me at Woods. Instead, she left a key and some documents attached to the door. I walked inside and looked around. It was quite old and claustrophobic. I unpacked a little before relaxing. After the long drive, doing little except watching TV at around 7 o'clock, but someone knocked on the door. When I checked my phone after getting up and saw that the woman had not texted to indicate she was coming over, I went up and peered through the peephole to see a man standing a few feet from the front of the porch. He maintained a serious expression as he said that he was coming to clean the fireplace. I opened it and said, "Hello, how may I help you?" I glanced at his vehicle, which was parked in the driveway behind my car, and then I turned to face him. "It's getting late, isn't it?" 7:30, he shrugged and said that was the planned time. I told him to wait a minute, shut the door, and walked back to the living room. I texted the woman and attempted to call her, but was unsuccessful. I then went to the fireplace, which wasn't particularly dirty, and I wasn't sure what to think. Perhaps the woman had hired a cleaning service as part of getting the house ready for me. Even if it wasn't my place, this may seem strange, but I assumed the man wasn't lying if he claimed to be a plumber or something, because fireplace cleaning seemed like such an arbitrary job. I think I would have been more dubious. When I returned, I opened the door to find the man just a few feet away on the porch. I was nearly alarmed by his unexpected proximity, and before I could respond, he said that he was attempting to leave on time tonight and wanted to start now, then moved closer and placed his hand on the door, gently pushing it open a little. I was starting to feel uneasy and was reconsidering everything, so I said, "Give me a minute more, and I'll let you." I tried to close the door, but the man I walked him over to the fireplace, and he followed me closely. He went up and looked at it for a brief moment, and as he turned around, I grabbed my keys. He left his hand on it and kept it open, knowing that I couldn't close it if he wasn't going to let me in, from the counter, and hurried outside to my car. The sound of the man's heavy footsteps shook the house as I got in and got into my car. He ran up to the window as I was turning it on, and his van was right behind me. I had to turn off the driveway and quickly return to the pavement while avoiding trees. Eventually, I called the police while driving, too afraid to stop, and when they got there, he and his van were gone, leaving the front door open, which made it obvious that he wasn't supposed to be there. The police and I are aware that the man likely knew that the house was being rented out, and that the new resident would not be aware of whether he was truly supposed to clean the fireplace or not, so he might be let from there. Anyone might speculate as to what he intended to do for.